Let's talk about what's going to happen on the 30th of March. Well, indeed, next year, 11:01 p.m. on the 29th of March 2019, because that is when we will officially be out of the EU. And if there isn't a deal done, well, then we're preparing for a no-deal Brexit, aren't we? Well, the Prime Minister has been blasted as fretful, weak and incompetent from Jacob Rees-Mogg, leading Eurosceptic backbench Tory MP, for failing to prepare for no-deal, but now choosing to use scare tactics. A new poll by Sky News has found that only 10% of people in Britain think that Theresa May is doing a good job negotiating Brexit. 74% are dissatisfied with her Prime Minister's performance as Prime Minister, and 50% now would support the holding of a second referendum. Well, let's talk about all this and indeed some issues with a Labour Party as well, with Alastair Campbell, Tony Blair's former spin doctor, leading Remain campaigner. Good morning to you, Alastair.
Patriot is the word you're looking for, Julia.
OK, let's go with that. Alice, it's always good to get the interview off to a good, happy start, I always think. Let's talk about no-deal planning. Is the decision to plan for a no-deal just long overdue, something we should have been doing as a strong negotiating tactic to know that we as a country can fare on WTO trade grounds absolutely fine, and showing the EU that we want a good deal, but don't worry, we're fine with that one? Or is it scaremongering?
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be either, but I mean, we have wasted 2 years. And part of the reason for that is that Theresa May put the Brexit extremists, the ideologues Davis, Johnson and Fox, into the key jobs. And I think they have just carried on thinking this is all going to kind of fall into place easily. I mean, don't forget, Liam Fox is the guy who said that making a trade deal would be the easiest trade deal in history. Boris Johnson said that there would be no cost to leaving. All the fantasies have gone away, and now belatedly they're starting to confront the reality. And I think the reality of no deal is pretty stark and pretty dangerous. But also, where you won't hear this very often, but where I agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg is I think that partly this is tactical by Theresa May, is that she's hoping that if there's enough kind of concern and worry and fear about crashing out with no deal, that people in Parliament and the public will think, oh, well, maybe her Chequers deal is not so bad after all, but her Chequers deal actually is the worst of all worlds. So whether you're a Remainer or a Leaver, and I think this explains the shift in the opinion polls, by the way, whether you're a Remainer or a Leaver, you cannot be happy with what is happening now. Me, from my perspective, you from yours, this is a disaster.
The negotiations absolutely have been a disaster. We certainly agree on that. But of course, I'm one of the ideologue extremists like Davis, Boris and Fox, and indeed the likes of Kate Hoey, Frank Field and others in your party who apparently are extremists for wanting something that 52% of the country want. There's no doubt at all that this Chequers deal is the worst of all worlds, quite apart from the fact it won't please Remainers like yourself, and it won't please people like me who actually want us to have Brexit in reality, not just in name only. But why are we so concerned about, you talk about the stark and dangerous worries of hard Brexit, people call it, or people crashing out, all this terminology is very much all about fear-mongering. I mean, the Director General of the World Trade Organization has said this: about half of the UK's trade is already on WTO terms with the US, China and several large emerging nations where the EU doesn't have trade agreements. So it's not the end of the world if the UK trades under WTO rules with the EU. It's not like trade between the UK and EU is going to stop. There will be an impact, but I suppose it's perfectly manageable. What exactly are we supposed to be worried about, Alastair?
Well, let me first of all deal with this thing about extremism. I think extremism is where you are ideologically committed to a position, and whatever the facts and whatever the costs and whatever the consequences,
that's describing you.
You're going to change that. That's the first thing.
That's describing you. If I could prove to you that Brexit would be an economic boon to the country, you'd still be a Remainer. You know perfectly well that's the case.
Well, hold on a minute. I just said a couple of minutes ago, I said where you'll find I'm in agreement with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, I don't think there's many things where he says in agreement with me. On the point about WTO, let me just give you one very specific thing, and it's something that has frankly obsessed me since the referendum campaign, and that's Northern Ireland. We still do not have an answer to the question of how, if we leave the political and economic institutions and we go in under WTO rules, how it is possible then to meet the pledge of the UK government, the desire of every single person on the island of Ireland, as far as I can work it out, and of the European Union, that there is no return to a hard border. So that's just one very...
Yes, there's a really easy way of doing that. We say we won't be putting up a hard border, and the Irish say they don't want a hard border. It's the Republic of Ireland. So if the Republic of Ireland are happy for the EU to come in and build a hard border in their country, that's entirely between them and the EU. It's got nothing to do with us at all.
Sorry, if you're trading under WTO rules, you have to monitor the traffic over borders.
As it already is monitored.
I think, and this is, sorry, it's not, because we're part of a single market and we're part of the customs union. This is where I think you do allow your ideology and your extremism to blind yourself to real problems that have to be addressed. And this is what's happening in the Brexit debate. I mean, I hesitate to say the words. Having said there's something on which I agree with Rees-Mogg, I hesitate to say the words, I feel rather sorry for Theresa May, because in many ways I don't. But she's coming up against the reality that what the British people voted for, and I accept they voted to leave, but then add in the red lines that she's thrown in, out of the single market, out of the customs union, out of the European Court of Justice, none of which, as far as I can recall, was on the ballot paper, or didn't have to be.
It was brought up in virtually every debate and every speech.
I'm not saying it wasn't, but the problem we've got into is that those who fought for Brexit on different reasons and on different grounds are now discovering that this has to be turned into treaty text, into language that then has to get legislated.
Democracy takes time and hard work and costs money. That's
exactly.
Yes,
Julia.
it's not a bad thing, Alastair.
That is why I agree. Democracy takes time, and democracy is not a moment. We had a moment on June the 23rd, 2016. Democracy is a process, and the reason why you're seeing these opinion polls shifting is because as the process unfolds, people frankly on both sides of the argument are starting to say, hold on a minute, is this really what we thought was going to happen? And that's why I think people like you and Boris and Davis and Fox, why are you getting more and more desperate? Why are you so
not
scared
desperate
of
at all.
Vote? I think you are, and you're very, very scared of a people's vote. Because
okay, well let's come on to that. The people's vote. You'd call it maybe a people's vote. Other people call it a second referendum. I call it a third referendum because we've already had two. Thank you very much. Look, we have put this to guests earlier in this show. Femi Olawale, who's from, of course, you'll know him from Our Future, Our Choice, a campaigner for this. Can you talk me through the process where we get to there being a full mandate for another referendum on whether or not we leave the EU? What would be the questions that would be asked? What would be the options available to people? And how we get to that point, given that it took us so many decades to get to the point, including a mandate from a general election manifesto to have the last referendum?
Yeah. No, I agree that the process is difficult and not clear. The first thing that has to happen, and this may not happen, but the deal that Theresa May finally puts to Parliament would have to get defeated, because it is up to Parliament. Only Parliament can decide to have a referendum, and looking at Parliament at the moment, I'm not sure. So that's the first, I accept, massive step. Would Parliament vote for that? I think the thing that would influence Parliament, the two things that would influence Parliament, one would be if this pretty hellish process continues, and the second would be if there continued to be a sense of a shift in public opinion, and MPs who are back in their constituencies now, as I think is happening, start to hear more and more people saying, hold on a minute, listen, you guys need to get a grip. So that's the first thing. Then for the question, again, Parliament has to take the lead in this, and at some point you have to legislate for that, get into the process, Electoral Commission, setting up the question and so forth. I would like there to be a question that has the option to remain, but equally, I accept that if my side of the argument just holds the same debate as last time, then we shouldn't be too surprised if we end up with, certainly, even if not with the same result, not with a convincing enough result on the other way. So there also has to be a continuing argument about the need for change and reform. So wait
a minute. You're not going to go back to trying to reform the EU, are there? I think we pretty much know that's a busted flush.
No, I don't think it is a busted flush, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that at the start of this debate, I did have one of my worries was that the European Union would just see this as a kind of British-only problem. I don't think they do anymore. I think they realise that there are the Brexit debate, the referendum, threw up some really serious questions for countries right across the world, not just in the European Union. And I do think actually that Macron and Merkel and some of the other European leaders are starting to think about those. You can't just say, look at what's happening in Italy, look at what's happening in Hungary, and say this isn't a problem. These are problems, and they have to be addressed. So I accept that the question is difficult. But I think where we're heading is actually to the possibility of the only real choices effectively being no deal or remain. And I think that is sort of where the politics.
But the key thing again is, can you get Parliament to make a decision to go through all the issues of getting to the point of ordering a referendum and do that before the end of March? Realistically, it will be a vote to return, to go back into the EU or to remain outside under no deal terms. And the reality is, the EU aren't going to be able to stop themselves from delivering a massive punishment to us for doing that.
I don't necessarily say that because I think actually there is still a desire for the UK to be part of the European Union, and I also think that the time frame, I agree, is very, very tight and very, very difficult. And but at some stage, it may suit both sides for that to be extended.
All right.
And I know Liam Fox has said that would be a disaster, but I think actually pragmatic, sensible people will think, look, there are so many issues still unresolved. We are going to need more time.
Pragmatic, sensible people as opposed to ideologue extremists like Leave voters, 52% of us. Let me get you on to... let me get you on to something different. Alastair Campbell, do you think it's right that momentum supporting Corbynistas in the Labour Party should be trying to oust the likes of Kate Hoey, Frank Field, Brexit supporting Labour MPs as the local MPs?
Well, I mean, again, you're looking at this through the Brexit telescope. I mean, there's a whole debate going on in the Labour Party at the moment about the relationship between MPs and members. I mean, I do find it pretty extraordinary for Kate Hoey to conduct herself in the way that she does and talk about representative democracy. She represents one of the most Remain constituencies in the country. And
she was re-elected last year.
She was re-elected.
And she stood on a Brexit. Everyone knew how she voted and how she campaigned in 2016. She was re-elected.
Yes, but as you said earlier, democracy is a complicated process. Part of democracy is what local parties think of their candidates and MPs. So, that will.
You're quite happy. Well, I think reading between the lines, Alastair, you're saying you're quite happy for their Brexit sabotagers, and they should be ousted.
The momentum, the whole business within the Labour Party of this constantly, and this is a sort of momentum Corbynista thing, of constantly holding over MPs the idea of deselection. In general, I don't like it, and I think I think actually the sort of the constant undermining of MPs. I don't like, but I do think that with Kate and also I think Andrew Donor said this morning. I think Frank Field is. I've known Frank for decades and decades, and I think Frank is somebody who's absolutely sort of dedicated to his area, his constituents, and so forth. But I do think that I'd have to put Kate in the ideological Brexit camp, I'm afraid.
So it's all right to oust her. OK, when it comes to ideology, there's been huge rows over the last week about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. That extraordinary joint front page from three leading Jewish newspapers accusing Jeremy Corbyn openly of anti-Semitism. Pieces in the Sunday papers this weekend basically saying, look, a lot of Labour MPs are preparing to leave the party. They fear that they're never going to get control back of the party. This isn't the Michael Foot early 80s years. You've got, bide your time, and in a decade you can have your party back for the moderates. They believe that the party has now lost a hook, line and sinker to the Corbynistas, and this anti-Semitism issue has now become a source of such shame and horror that they don't want any part of it. Are you planning to leave the Labour Party?
I'm being tested for sure. I think a lot of people are. I don't want to leave the Labour Party because it's a party that I still feel is the best possible vehicle for the kind of change and the values that I believe in. But I think that when I look at the way that Jeremy Corbyn spoke last week about Brexit, where he seemed to be frankly echoing some of the UKIP lines on Brexit, and when I look at the way that they've failed to deal with anti-Semitism, then they make it very, very difficult. I guess the one thing that keeps me in right now is the fact that I've got no doubt that some of the people who are spewing out this nonsense at the moment would be more than happy if people like me left the Labour Party. But here's the other thing. You talked about the polls on Brexit. It is quite incredible to me, as somebody who helped the Labour Party go from being a losing party to a party that won 3 elections in a row. It is incredible that we're facing possibly the most incompetent, divided, useless government in living memory, and they're neck and neck in the polls with Labour. Labour should be 10, 15, 20 points ahead. And the reason that they're not, I think they've not handled Brexit well. I think Jeremy Corbyn trying to face both ways is wrong, and people have sensed actually that he's not actually being totally honest about his own views and his own position. He's basically a Brexiteer. Well, he should just stand up and say so. And then I think also it means that in terms of other issues, they're not really giving that much leadership in that sense, that much a sense of direction. And these things don't happen in a vacuum. One of the reasons why this anti-Semitism has become such a sort of huge thing, they blame other people. They say it's all about the media, it's all about the
They
Blair
mostly blame the
rights and all this
Jews, actually, it would appear.
Well,
it's
and
kind of
there's
the
a bit of
problem.
that as well. But it is a problem, and of course it's a classic thing where you've historically, for obvious reasons to do with the Holocaust, the most anti-Semitism is generally associated with the right and the hard right, and it's still a very horrible and potent force on the hard right. But there's always been this element on the left that has deliberately conflated hatred of Israel with anti-Semitism. And that is just something that is intolerable. I've never understood it.
But you're staying for... Let's just in one word. You're staying for now.
I'm definitely staying for now.
Okay.
And partly because I still believe, it pains me in a way to say it, I still believe that the Labour Party, unless we can shift opinion within the Labour Party about what's happening in this wretched Brexit debate, then we're going to struggle.
The Brexit Briefing on Talk Radio. Get the broader perspective, only with The Times and The Sunday Times.